a story about a preacher who had to fill in for the Sunday school teacher when she ended up catching a cold. But he had no idea where she was in the curriculum, so he decided to just do kind of the greatest hits of Bible stories. He told the kids about how Joshua walked around the city of Jericho when the walls fell down. How David put a little stone into his sling and killed Goliath with one shot. He told them about how Jonah had been swallowed up by a whale and spat out on the shore, and how Moses had raised up his staff and parted the Red Sea. And he said, now, given the faith of all these great people, where and when can we demonstrate the same kind of faith, children? And one little boy said, I know, preacher. He said, okay, you tell me. He said, next week at Myrtle Beach. And he said, what do you mean by that? Why there and then? He said, well, I'm going on vacation. I've never seen a city with a wall. I've never seen a giant, I've certainly never seen a fish big enough to swallow me. But we're going to the ocean, so I think I can handle that one. Sometimes in our everyday lives, when we're trying to figure out how to be good Christians, we can look at all of the great things that have happened in our spiritual history and find ourselves with severely lacking opportunities as great as the ones that we see as examples. We're going to reinforce that perspective and then break it down all in the course of our lesson today. Our lesson will be from Hebrews in chapter 11. This chapter, for the Hebrew writer and for his audience, was a chance to reflect on the spiritual history that his Jewish Christians that he was writing to were very intimately aware of. They were very familiar with all of these Old Testament Bible characters, but the perspective that they had on them was stuck in that era. So we're going to move on from there, as well as they did, and look at examples of faith being put into practice. The Hebrew writer starts out this chapter this way. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. Looking at that definition alone, we start to get a picture of what we'll be talking about today. If you thought faith meant believe in God, think He's real, agree to the fact that He exists, you would be missing out on a better definition. Faith is not just simply saying, well, I'm not an atheist. I think God is a real person, a real entity, the creator of the universe. He's all the things He says He is. Faith is instead the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is not merely believing, but trusting in those things which we cannot confirm with the senses of our physical bodies. Verse 3 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which were visible. By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up he was pleasing to God. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith Abraham, when he was a child, obeyed by going out to a place when he was called, not when he was a child, I'm sorry. Holding it a little close to my face, I guess. When he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born of even one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So we see these first examples of faith from the very earliest parts of our history, and we see that God is committing to them a sort of promise of individual faith. And Abraham himself becomes the recipient of a promise that would affect many, many people, innumerable people, in fact, the scripture says. But the consequence of that faith was not just their own relationship with God and the relationship of all the people that would come after them, but it set the standard by which faith was to be measured going forward. Verse 13 says this, all these died in faith without receiving the promises. Let me repeat that for you. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they went out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You see, their faith was not just that God was going to fulfill material things for them. It was that God was doing something spiritually much more significant. The Hebrew writer tells us that the faith of those early examples was built on a promise that God had made to them as individual people, that he had a relationship with them. And so we arrive in a very similar situation. We're not a race that has been saved. We're individuals that have been saved. We're not born into a chosen people as Gentiles, but instead we have to choose to follow God. And so we have a closer understanding of our relationship with God, as Abraham did, than some of the people who the Hebrew writer was even writing to. Continuing on, though, in verse 17, he's going to talk more about Abraham. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, in which he also received him back as a type. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel, and gave orders concerning his bones. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. So one of the amazing things about this chapter, just to sort of take it aside here, is that we're looking at a bunch of little tableaus of our spiritual history, our heritage that has led us to Christ. And as we do that, we reflect on their individual expressions of faith. But Moses's becomes all the more striking and all the more significant when you realize that Moses, being a prophet, was looking forward to the anointed one of Christ coming to fulfill the promise for God. The Hebrew writer says there in verse 26 that he considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. That Moses was willing, in his faith, to put aside something that wouldn't happen for thousands of years. Put aside things that would happen right now for something that wouldn't happen for thousands of years. That was the significance of Moses' belief here. And for us, the relationship becomes even more important. Because the old law that came through Moses, which instructed those people who came after him on how to behave, was set up as a way to prove their loyalty and their relationship to God to themselves and to the people around them. But the law could not overcome the promise of Abraham. They were still fulfilling that promise by being born and following God. But it required their faith beyond just their compliance with the law. So that's why when we arrive in verse 30, it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace." You remember from last summer when we were talking about Joshua, we spent time in that book. And what was this battle after the Battle of Jericho they tried to do? The Battle of Ai, or Ai, depending on your pronunciation of that word. They went out and they lost because there was one man who acted in selfishness and not in faith. God said to destroy all of the riches of Jericho. Don't put a single thing. Put everything, and there was not to be a single thing taken as plunder. But that man spoiled it for everyone by being disobedient, by not acting in faith. So that's why the example of faith is Jericho. And we've got the bad example of Ai immediately following. There is just as much opportunity for failure as there is for success. But that's not the focus of what we're looking at here. We're looking at these winners that have been champions of the faith up to this point. We have a few more examples to look at, and then we'll start in chapter 12 and look at the real conclusion for us today. What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might attain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. All these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. The believers that came in this era that have been described were all awaiting the promise that was given to you, Christians, the Hebrew writer says. All of those men who went through all of those things, exhibited such great faith, were looking forward to what you get to enjoy right now. And they did all of those great things because of their faith. And it was not those great accomplishments that were worth mentioning. It was indeed the approval they gained, in verse 39, through their faith. That is the conclusion to this. But it's not either. Because the Hebrew writer is going to use a metaphor in the next few verses that is very important. There, in the era that these people were reading, was a common practice of having games in a Colosseum. All over the Roman world, and even among Jewish people, this would have been a pastime that was well known. In the Colosseum, there are races, there are all kinds of things, but especially in the cases of races and other sort of track and field type sports as we think of them today, there was what was called the clap. And set up in the middle of the race track, there was an elevated platform where all the previous winners sat and watched the race. So the race was not just spectated by whoever was the governmental leader of that area, the prefect, or whoever was in charge of that region, the governor. It wasn't just spectated by all the individuals who came, paid their penny to watch the race. It wasn't just spectated by all of the people who came there to socialize and be seen in in public, but it was spectated by everybody who had been successful on that track before. They sat upon the cloud, they wore their laurel wreaths of victory, and they watched as everyone raced. So with that in mind, let's read the beginning of chapter 12. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The faith that all of those men, all throughout history, from the very beginning, he went all the way back to the very beginning of the book of Genesis to tell you about all the faithful people. That faith is what we are attaining, not the miraculous deeds, not all of the incredible accomplishments. All of those things are put aside because what they are trying to gain, as verse 39 of chapter 11 said, was approval through their faith. And we have already attained that through our faith in Jesus. We have a great cloud of witnesses watching us run the race. We're going for the same goal they were running for, the approval that comes through faith. You can't attain that by being a great person. Being a great person comes as a consequence of attaining that through Jesus. If you want to do great things, it starts with your faith. It doesn't end up in faith after you've accomplished what you think you need to be a Christian. God has predetermined that you're going to win. If you run the race, you end up in the cloud. You'll be watching with everybody else as the next generation starts running too. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is what? The author and perfecter of faith. Jesus is the perfect example of faith. How can Jesus be an example of faith, preacher? He was God. How can he believe in himself? Because faith is not belief only, but the actions you take because of that. He showed us the pattern by doing everything that needed to be done and set before us the perfect example of faith because he accomplished all the things that faith required of him. Namely, despising the shame, he endured the cross, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus is in the cloud too. He's just as victorious as the other people in faith. But he's sitting next to the ruler in the king's box at the racetrack. He's attained a greater position even than those in the cloud. And so as those previous champions look on as we're running the race, and as Jesus himself looks on as we're running this race, how can we become weary? How can we let ourselves get tripped up by sin? How can we not just run with every bit of energy that God has put in us? How do we fail to achieve a goal that God has already told you are going to do it? You are going to accomplish it. You are a winner. I hope that has been encouraging for you today, and that you can look at those examples that we have in faith and know that our spiritual history is full of people who simply did what God asked of them. As we go out into our week this week, let's apply that teaching. If there's anyone who has not become serious to the gospel and become a person who not only believes in God but follows what he has us to do, we would offer that opportunity now, that we would invite you to be baptized. But if you have been baptized and fallen away, or if you need encouragement from the church, you may come forward for those as well as we stand.